Do you know that our nonprofit, Better Burma, has its own shop, which also sells crafts sourced from artisan communities across Myanmar? Each piece is unique and handmade and reflects the country's amazing diversity. Not only that, your purchase will not only support the artists themselves, but also help fund our wider humanitarian and media missions. Please take a moment to visit our shop at alokacrafts.com. That's ALOKA crafts.com.
And welcome back. My guest today is Peter Morris, who is described in his bio as a lawyer, a journalist, and an aspiring linguist who has written an article in The Diplomat, which I would say is well worth reading. It's entitled Why the US Needs to Back Myanmar's Spring Revolution. And it is a rare piece of very direct, very confrontational statement of needs towards Western requirement. So, Peter, would you like to introduce yourself and we can talk about this article a little bit?
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'll take that as a compliment, confrontational. So my name's Peter Morris. I'm a lawyer and a journalist, and yeah, an advocate for Burma, and so that causes challenges sometimes because um, you know, when you're a journalist, in theory you're supposed to be unbiased. And when I started writing this latest piece that you mentioned, it was it was kind of unclear whether it was like a regular news piece or an op-ed. And then the editors I was working with, they're like, okay, we got to do this as an op-ed, and you got to cut it down. So I had to restructure it. And then, of course, when you cut things down, it takes forever to cut it down and summarize everything. So it took me like a month to finish this thing. But I'm glad that I got support and from the patient editor at the Diplomat, Strangio.
Mm. I by happenstance, I do happen to have a little bit of experience. I also had an op-ed published in the Diplomat. I was fortunate enough
Mm-hmm.
to share that distinction, and I have to agree with you. The team at the Diplomat actually very good, very professional, and
Yeah, yeah.
very minimal sort of edits on the content of my work. So I had very positive experience with them.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so let's jump into the meat of this because this is something that I and some other people have been sort of talking about, that there is a sort of lack in the reportage when it comes to Myanmar. People are not really focused on it, and those who are trying to write about it are not really going into depth. You here, you cite quite a few people. I mean, you cite, Matthew Arnold's episode with Inside Myanmar. You cite David Matheson. You cite Mimi Winbird. You cite quite a few people, and you provide the links to strengthen your argument, and you're making clear geostrategic arguments along the way. So that being said, let's just take a step back from the case to support Myanmar. Let's look at the situation as it stands. How do you perceive the situation in Myanmar right now? What do you think is going to happen in the coming months and the coming years?
Hmm. Yeah. So, I, you know. I think the Spring Revolution is on the verge of winning, but we just don't know how long it's going to take. And Anthony Davis, in a piece that he wrote, talked about black swan events, which, from my understanding, is just kind of something that's bound to happen, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Maybe someone will like assassinate the line, or maybe there'll be like a huge victory or defection or whatever. Um, I think that is going to happen pretty soon. Or what will happen is there's all this a kind of snowball effect has already started, right? Especially after 1027, where you get one surrender or defection, and then that leads to another one. And it seems like the word is going around
Mm.
the junta soldiers that the junta is not doing well, and that makes the soldiers who have already had low morale since like the beginning even have
Mm.
lower morale and more be more willing to give up. And I think, I don't know if you saw, but just yesterday, so I saw something about the junta put an article in one of its newspapers saying like, "Oh, actually, we're not losing," you know. So I think it's only a matter of time, and I mean, I honestly I don't know how useful of an exercise it is to try to pinpoint an exact date. Maybe I think it's more useful to say like, okay, relatively near future, and so that therefore we got to start planning now. That's the whole point. And that was like one of the main points of the article. Is like I was trying to uh, inform U.S. policymakers. It's like, hey, look, the Spring Revolution is on the verge of winning. They're going to win relatively soon, so we got to think about what to do. At the very least, you got to ramp up humanitarian aid, because that will expedite that by itself will expedite the fall of the junta, because it'll free up resources that are currently being
Mm.
used by resistance organizations to feed and house all these refugees and injured people and everything.
Mm. Absolutely, and I like that you bring up Anthony Davis, which I assume most of our readers would be familiar with. I mean, he's quite well known. He's quite prolific, and
Mm,
what I really like about him is that he was actually quite negative towards the prospects of the revolution
mm,
early on. If you read some of his
right.
pieces back in
Yeah, I remember
2021,
that. Yeah, I remember
and
that.
so
Yeah,
he's come around and he's changed his
yeah,
opinion in as new evidence has come to light and as situations have shifted. So it's
yeah,
I look at him as a case of a person who
yeah.
isn't saying that the revolution is doing well because he's a fanboy of the revolution and has been since day
Right,
one.
right.
This is
Yeah,
someone who's looking at facts and has
yeah.
had to change his perspective, and that's the
Mhm.
responsible and mature thing. So it's
Yeah,
it's really good that we have people like you and people like Matthew Arnold and a series of other people
yeah.
lately who are coming on saying this revolution is going to win. Like, we don't know when, we don't know how, but it's
Right,
going to happen.
right,
But
right.
then, so this is then that the devil's advocate question,
Mm,
which I'm sure a lot of people would be pondering. If
mm,
the revolution's victory is assured,
mm, mm.
why then is it so important for outsiders to get involved? I mean, if the race is almost over,
Right,
why
right.
bother at this point?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one thing is that logistically, at the very least, we need Thailand's help, right? So, and then I just saw today, thank goodness Thailand is starting to take the lead on humanitarian aid efforts. Now, of course, they're they're like the first thing they did was, oh, let's work with the junta on humanitarian aid.
Mm.
But you know what? The second thing they did was, I just saw today, they said, oh, we want to set up a kind of humanitarian relief effort through ASEAN, which sounds pretty good to me. I mean, at least it's better than going through the junta.
Mm. I mean, I mean, the irony we saw a year ago or a little bit more
Mm,
when people were sending aid to Myanmar, but because it was going through junta channels, the
right,
aid you're sending is being sold off in markets to raise
right.
money for the military to continue
Yeah,
perpetuating the crimes that we're trying to
yeah,
alleviate.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
absurd.
Yeah.
Um, so thank
Yeah.
God that there's been a shift
Right.
in policy.
Right.
And
And I mean,
actually,
yeah.
the Chinese policy as well, I want you to quickly comment on, because
Mm.
you do talk about Chinese policy and you do give a couple of reasons for that, but they seem to be shifting as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought I saw today something about China mentioning humanitarian aid corridors. That
Mm,
could be wrong. I don't remember seeing anything about that before, but um, if that's true, that's a great sign. I mean, if China could somehow cooperate on that. Um, so yeah, but aside from that, I mean, my general impression is that the China is just confused about what to do because it has like all of these competing interests. And one example of this confusion I saw today news about. Um, yeah, the Chinese ambassador, he published he published an article in the junta mouthpiece, Global
mm,
New Light of Myanmar. That was, oh wow, this is dated January 11th, but I just saw it today. Anyways, he published an article saying uh, uh, um, it says we have to work towards the shared community with a shared future or some kind of
mm.
BS like that. I mean, I mean, how is that? what it- I don't know what the purpose of doing that is, and they
But I
and they
think
went out of their way to do it.
that's the thing with China, is that we have to remember that
Mm,
whatever the Chinese do, they
mm.
do for a purpose. Like there was an intention behind it.
Right,
They
right,
know what the audience is,
right.
even if it's sometimes difficult. And so putting it
Yeah,
into global new light,
yeah.
that in and of itself is pretty bold, because that's communicating directly to the military and their supporters.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, maybe maybe I should say that I mean, yes, they do it for a purpose, but the problem is that they have competing interests, right? Like I said earlier, like on the one hand, they want to build this corridor to the Indian Ocean. But on the other hand, they need stability to do that, and
Mm,
they've realized by now that the junta cannot provide them with the stability. So that's one of the reasons why they tacitly supported Operation 1027, and now they don't know what to do because they're kind of stuck because it's like, okay, let's if they assume that okay the junta is going to fall, then that means a democratic leaning regime is going to be set up, and they don't want that either. So they so they
mm,
have all these competing interests, and that all the recent supposed ceasefire, which broke down right away, surprise,
mm,
surprise, that's also kind of an evidence which shows that they just kind of policy confusion. They don't really know what the best way forward, what the best way forward is.
mm.
Because I mean, if what is the, I mean, okay, the point, I guess the point of doing a ceasefire is to have stability in northern Myanmar, right? But I mean, just because you have stability in northern Myanmar doesn't mean you can have stability anywhere else in Myanmar. And the ceasefire didn't even work, so they don't even have stability in northern Myanmar.
I mean, those ceasefires themselves are a fascinating topic that I've been spending the last couple of days trying to reach out through back channels to get as much information on them as I can.
Yeah,
And the word that I'm getting from a lot of people who are commenting, unofficially, but who are much more in the know than I am, is that, well, why would you even pay these ceasefires, any mind? Why would you give them the time of day? Like, we all know that there was going to be some notional ceasefire put on the table, and that it was gonna, fall apart reasonably quickly, and it was never intended to actually last. It's all just sort of part of the dance. And so there's a perception from these ceasefires. Like, people look at the ceasefires and they look at China, putting its hand up, saying like, look at us, like we're brokering peace and negotiation. And um, but deep down, when you look at what's going on the ground, it doesn't really seem to be changing things. It just it sends a message. But like on this broader Chinese scope, I'm glad that you mentioned the Indian Ocean, because in your article you specifically talk about the Strait of Malacca. I think you refer to it as the Malacca dilemma. And so for those who are not aware, that the Strait of Malacca is a very, very, very heavily utilized shipping lane, I think on the south of Malaysia. And it's one of the vital choke points that, if it were closed to Chinese shipping, would effectively stop the Chinese, whose ports are all east of the Malay archipelago, from being able to transit to west of the Malay archipelago into the Indian Ocean, and through the Indian Ocean to, Africa and the Suez Canal and Europe and so on. And the Chinese have been very, very, very concerned over the possibility that their ability to transit through the Malay archipelago could, in the event of escalating tensions or conflict, be cut off from them. And they have desperately been looking for a solution to circumvent the Malay archipelago so that they can get around and access the Indian Ocean in another way. The port of Rangoon, now Yangon, historically has been one of the largest ports outside of North America. And, one and one make two, and the Chinese have realized this. So, how much do you think the Chinese are really sort of thinking about utilizing the infrastructure that Myanmar offers west of the Malay Peninsula into the Indian Ocean, in their foreign policy, in their changing attitudes? Because you talk about stability, it seems like they don't really care who's in charge; they just care that they can operate in Myanmar.
Right, right, and of course, everyone says that. Everyone notes that the China had good relations with the government under Aung San Suu Kyi, and that they made some progress on the China Myanmar economic corridor. And so, yeah, I mean, China is definitely obsessed with um, finding and expanding as many routes they have, uh, which do not which help them avoid the Malacca Straits. And yeah, they've been obsessed with accessing the Indian Ocean through Myanmar for a long time, and they're also trying to develop other ways around. I think like through Russia and Central Asia, for example. That's another. I mean, like I said in the piece, it's just a matter of degree. Like the more routes and the larger these routes are, the faster these routes are that China has available to them, the more leverage they have uh, over the United States, and the less, and conversely, the less leverage the U.S. has to deter China from doing something stupid like invading Taiwan. I mean, maybe in the eyes of China, it's not something stupid, but the reason I say it's stupid is because, um, you know, Xi Jinping, like he's, as I said in the article, it's like he's so obsessed with Taiwan that he's on the verge of painting himself into a corner, or maybe he has already painted himself into a corner. And I think that's what a lot of people are worried about. And now that he's in that position, it's like, what is he going to do?
Mm.
And he might come under pressure from these ultra nationalists in China to do something, even if he doesn't want to do, even if he thinks it's foolish. And that's what I mean by stupid.
And I agree with you. I mean, this is obviously very conjecture, but this is something that seems to come up when a leader slowly transitions into a dictator, as I think we can reasonably uncontroversially say Xi Jinping has, and subsequently, as they start to age. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I am almost certain, was driven mostly by Vladimir Putin needing to leave a legacy behind, this obsession that a lot of these very powerful iron-fisted leaders
Oh
have with
yeah.
their legacy. And Kiev is a historically important city to Eastern Slavs and to Orthodox Christians and so on. And being able to take Crimea back was a big feather in his cap, and being able to complete that would have been something that really cemented his role in Russian modern history, I have a fear that Xi Jinping wants the reunification of China and Taiwan to happen under his tenure, and he knows that there's only so long that he can that he can hold on to power. Considering how he got rid of the other people in positions
Mm.
of power, he knows that that can happen to him. So it is conjecture, but I share your concerns, because I do think that these pressures very much exist. But sort of on that topic, and I know this is asking for conjecture, and it may not be in your wheelhouse, but when we talk about having access to Myanmar, Chinese access to Myanmar, we talk about having access to the Indian Ocean.
Mm.
The focus has been on trade, but it doesn't escape notice that China has increasing interests in Africa, some of them in very unstable areas, that
Mm.
Myanmar borders India, which is a direct rival of China, on the other side of which is Pakistan, a Chinese ally. Myanmar borders Thailand, who is notionally allied to the United States. Is there, do you think, the possibility that China also wants to use Myanmar to project military power into Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean more broadly?
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean that's possible. Like I'm sure that I'm sure they're hoping to do that. I mean, maybe, you know, maybe they're hoping that at some point some regime based in Myanmar, who regardless of who it is, would allow them to do that. And then of course, like you've got a lot of people say that these uh, nominally civilian ports around the world that China is invested in can like easily be used for military purposes. So that might be part of Chinese thinking as well. Yeah, it's certainly possible.
Because you quote in your article Mimi Win Bird, um, who actually has a military background, as saying that Myanmar is America's quote strategic blind spot, or largest strategic blind spot.
Yeah,
Um, so that's, this is something that clearly needs more focus and needs more attention.
right.
And so this sort of segues onto a different issue, which is the reportage. You've come into this space, you've written this op-ed, and clearly this is not your first article. Like you have a journalistic background. Do you find that there is something sort of lacking in the general coverage in English language media as regards Myanmar? Like, do you think that something is missing, or that something more should be done to raise awareness and to get information into the hands and the heads of the people who need to have it?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, yeah, I think the English language media doesn't really have the resources to get information, unlike the Burmese newspapers, they got like people on the ground inside Myanmar.
Mm,
That for the Western newspapers, it's a lot harder for them to. I mean, yeah, they can work with Burmese people. They have Burmese people working for them, but it's just a lot. They just don't have the resources to do that. And so one example is like even the New York Times, which probably has the most resources out of any English language publication in the world. Maybe I don't know about that, but they have a lot of resources, and yet how long did it take them? To write that story, what is it called? The country that bombs its own people. Remember that title? Yeah, so that was just like basically an expose of the junta's scorched earth tactics of bombing innocent civilians, burning down villages, and all this stuff. That just the kind of terror tactics that they use to scare civilians into giving up support for the revolution or putting pressure on the resistance forces to give up or something like that. So, but it took them a long time to publish that, and I was
mm,
upset about it. And when it finally came out, I posted a link to that article on social media, and then in a comment to that link, I said something like, "Well, why did it take so long for the New York Times to do this? I mean, yeah, when you're a journalist, you want to like make sure to get credible sources and double check and maybe triple check and all that. But I mean, yeah, I think what they did in that article was they used satellite images, and okay, that's good. But like, why not use oral testimony from people whose houses were burned down or that was subject to bomb or something like that? I mean, oral testimony is just as valid of a piece of evidence as anything else. I mean, it just with both the law and in journalism, it's like it's a valid piece of evidence. And the key question is just like, how much weight do you give the evidence? Yeah, how much weight do you give the evidence? So people can judge for themselves. So like, for example, if they got let's say they got let's say they got three people from the same village that burned down. They all said, okay, yeah, these junta people came in, they burned down our village. If I was, a writer, I would say, okay, that's enough. As far as I'm concerned, that's enough evidence to publish a story saying, hey, the junta is burning down villages to terrorize people, and they could have. New York Times could have done that a long time ago, but it took. But for some reason they didn't. I don't know. I don't know why not.
Yeah. So I found the actual New York Times article you're talking about. It was
Yeah.
published halfway through 2023.
Yeah.
So the actual publication date is July 31st, 2023. The article is called "The Country That Bombs Its Own People," in
Yeah.
case anybody wants to look it up. And yeah, it's kind of strange. They've got they've got good footage. So the article itself, I think, is quite well done. The footage that they've got is very relevant and not footage that has just been circulating on social media everywhere. They've clearly done quite a bit of research here. They've got some really good images as well from the ground.
Yeah.
So at least respect to them for doing that and for writing this article and putting it together. But
Mm.
again, I agree. As you say, halfway through 2023 is 2.5 years into the conflict, and the military were bombing people far before that. So I do take your point. But so then let's let's just try to do our jobs of spreading this information as much as we can. So your piece, your op-ed here is fundamentally making an argument. You're trying to make the argument for why should the West get involved. So I'm going to ask then, in ethical terms, I think everyone who's listening to this podcast is already 100% behind us. We understand the ethical argument and we can probably make it in our sleeps. But let's move to an economic argument. What is the economic argument for Western involvement in Myanmar and support for the revolution?
The economic argument. That's a good question. Well, I mean, let's assume that the revolution wins and a new democratic government is set up. What would foreign companies, foreign governments, what would they be looking for this time around? Because they know they kind of made a bunch of mistakes last time around, and they also know that it's not kind of paradise in terms of profiting, at least in the short term. So I think that there'll probably be more of a focus on infrastructure type investment. And for that reason, I think Japan will probably play a big role. I mean, they've always played a big role in Burma, and I think, and that's like one of the reasons I'm actually based in Japan now, is to try to work on Japan's Myanmar policy. So yeah, I think I think and I hope that infrastructure will be a priority, and then also things like education and health and stuff like that. Yeah, sort of I mean, it's the kind. I mean, it's the kind of thing that's more of a long-term payout, right? But yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. It's a really good question. Yeah, I I don't know.
Yeah, because I think we do need to engage corporate interest
Right,
as
right.
well in order to
Yeah,
do that. And
yeah,
then, so let's then also recap. What is the sort of strategic thing? Because we've spoken a lot about China
yeah,
and the sort of threat that inaction on Myanmar poses. But what do you think is the strategic political gain that Western powers, I mean, your focus is the United States, that the United States could gain by coming in, by overtly supporting the national unity government, the revolution, and assisting in some capacity in the transition to a democracy?
Oh, okay. What can I just make one final point about your last question?
Yeah, please, please.
Okay, so first of all, I'm not much of an economist, but I know that Japan likes to do these public-private partnership projects. Okay, and so maybe for that reason, maybe companies, at least Japanese companies, will be eager to get involved. Because they can get contracts from Japanese government, right? So, but maybe who knows? Maybe other countries will have a similar type of model. So that's just one thing to note for if we, I mean, in other words, at the very least, we can attract Japanese companies. So yeah, so that's that. And then the other thing about right, strategic benefit. I mean, yeah, I mean, like I said, one strategic benefit is sort of deterring Xi Jinping from doing something foolish on Taiwan. But I think it all. I mean, having the more leverage the U.S. is able to maintain vis-a-vis China, I think the less sort of misadventurism China will engage in, and I'm thinking in particular encroaching on neighboring countries and contested areas in South China Sea and stuff like that. Like they just, I mean, China has been, having from the Indian perspective, China has been encroaching on India, and then we've got the Philippines and what else is there? I mean, their neighbors in particular, right? They've been very assertive lately, China.
Absolutely. And do you feel that from the ASEAN perspective, is there a threat to ASEAN as a whole if Myanmar just sort of reverts back to this military dictatorship, or potentially, as we'll talk about in a little bit, if Myanmar were to disintegrate to some extent, would ASEAN stand to lose from that?
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and then, in fact, I, once again, I was really glad to see what Thailand has been doing lately. They had some kind of discussion at the World Economic Forum about Myanmar, and Thailand is clear that it wants to be a kind of leader in the humanitarian aid effort. And then they explicitly said, if Myanmar falls apart, it's going to affect the entire region. And I think Thailand sees the writing on the wall that the regime is falling, and so they know that the number of displaced people and refugees and injured people is just going to increase because the junta has proven that as it gets more and more desperate to stave off its inevitable defeat, it just ramps up attacks on civilians. And even before Operation 1027, Matthew Arnold, his statistics were showing that 2/3 of all junta attacks were against civilians, and it's just going to get worse and worse. And it's sad to say that there's going to be a lot more, civilian injuries and displacement until the junta is finally defeated. And that's why I really want to encourage countries to give humanitarian aid, because that'll expedite the downfall of the junta and reduce the pain and suffering to the extent we can. The faster they fall, the less suffering there will be. And Thailand is not stupid. Thailand, they know probably more than anybody any country in the world the situation in Myanmar. And so yeah, and they see the writing on the wall, and the fact that they're trying to do something about it now says a lot. And people might complain like, oh, Thailand is only working directly with the junta, and yes, that's not effective, but I think that Thailand, the only reason they're working with the junta on this is to kind of like save face for the junta, and meanwhile, they're making sort of alternative plans, such as through they mentioned having a humanitarian aid operation led by ASEAN. So I mean, both China and Thailand, these governments are kind of playing this delicate dance where they try to save face for the junta, for their supposed ally, the junta, which they know is like on the verge of being toppled, and so that, but they still have to pretend that they're friends and making agreements and ceasefire or whatever. So that's what I think is going on here.
It's interesting. And one thing that I'm noticing from the way that you're speaking, you're being very careful to focus on humanitarian aid.
Mm-hmm.
Are you how do you feel about the prospect of doing more than just delivering humanitarian aid? Because very few people have been willing to even countenance the possibility of what's generally referred to as lethal aid. But what about things like aid in forms of fuel or in forms of vehicles or things that could theoretically be utilized by the revolution to do things more than just keep the starving people from dying of starvation, keep the exposed people from dying of exposure, something that can actually actively increase the speed of the revolution? Where do you stand on that?
Right. That's a really good question. I mean, yeah, a lot of a lot of people that I sent my article to, they're like, "Oh, you're calling for intervention, and this is gonna, lead to proxy war and like who knows, World War III or something like that." So, I understand their concern, and yeah, I think it would be a huge mistake for the U.S. to send a bunch of weapons over there and do something silly like they did in the 1950s with the KMT. Um, um, but I think short of that, I think there's something the U.S. can do besides humanitarian aid. I mean, at the very least, I think the U.S. Should distribute everything that was authorized by Congress in the Burma Act. And I haven't looked at what's in the Burma Act, but I should. But it says non-lethal aid, so who knows what that is? But then of course there's another question. It's like, well, how do you draw the line between lethal and non-lethal aid, right? Like, are bulletproof vests lethal or non-lethal? I don't know. But one thing I want to note is that, okay, yeah, maybe China got spooked after they found out the Burma Act was going to pass. But in fact, I mean, I I don't think that was a real game changer. I think China just overreacted, and so what I'm trying to say is, if the U.S. Tries to push it, tries to push the limit just a little bit, not sending like all these heavy weapons and turning it into some proxy war. I mean, the NUG and Myanmar people and ethnic groups and everything, they would not allow the U.S. to do a proxy war anyway. So that's off the table. Even if the U.S. wanted to, which it can't. Well, even if it was willing and able, which it's not, it can't. It's not willing to do it, and it can't. It's so stretched right now. The U.S. can't do it. So, but even if somehow the U.S. was willing and able to do it, the Myanmar people will not let them. Okay, so, but I think there's something at least the U.S. can do above and beyond uh, uh, humanitarian aid alone, and at the very least, distributing everything that's in the Burma Act, and yeah, I think they can push the limit just a little bit. And now what exactly that means, I don't know, because I'm not a humanitarian aid specialist. I'm not a military person. I have no idea, but I think they can push the limit a little bit. And yes, it's a risk. Okay, we don't want to be naive about it. Yes, it's a risk, but I don't think it's a big risk. Number one, and number two, I think it's a risk worth taking because, like I said, the faster the junta is defeated, the less people will suffer. Yeah.
So I find it very interesting that you brought up this concept of a proxy war.
Mm,
And so I take your point that the United States is not inclined to and is not capable of,
mm,
sending in a whole bunch of guns and bombs. And even if they wanted to, the Myanmar people would not stand for it. But just following this hypothetical,
mm,
focusing on the Chinese angle, if we're talking proxy war, I mean the United States typical proxy war opponents would be China or Russia.
mm,
Now, Russia is very much tied up in Ukraine, and from what we're hearing, they're not in a position to support the junta, even though they otherwise normally would. They just don't have the free resources to deal with it right now.
right.
And Chinese policy, as you yourself have been writing about, has shifted to understanding that, well, the junta doesn't really represent the stability that China needs.
Mm,
And as you also mentioned in your article, the scam centers. When we interviewed Jason Tower, the numbers that he gave us were absolutely horrifying. We're talking about
yeah.
something in the scope of 150,000 people being kept as slaves in
Right.
Myanmar, many of them Chinese nationals. So that being the case,
Right.
neither the Russians nor the Chinese seem to be inclined to actively support the junta. Are you of the mind that if the West were to try and ramp up its operations in Myanmar, that
Mm.
could trigger a change in attitude from China?
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's why I mentioned like the limit.
Mm,
I think the U.S. can push the limit, especially because China has lost faith in the junta.
hmm
The junta can't provide the stability that China wants, so it probably wouldn't mind if the if the junta were to fall. And for that reason, I think the U.S. can push the limit, and like I said, I think it's a risk worth taking. Now, but of course, once you go over the limit, then China might do something. But practically speaking, what would China do? I mean, are they going to arm
mm,
like are they going to arm the junta? I don't know. I doubt it. I mean, they are arming the junta, but are they going to increase their arming of the junta? Are they going to send Chinese troops in there? I mean, I doubt it. And this is why I'm saying it's not a huge risk.
mm. I mean, I think that's a good point. But this sort of segues us to another issue. So
Mm,
the Chinese have a lot of influence over certain ethnic armed organizations, most notably the United
mm,
Wa State Army.
mm, mm,
Now, the interesting thing is, and this came from discussions that I was having quite a while back, where someone was commenting to me that, well, yeah, if you went back a few decades and you said, oh, well, a few hundred assault rifles fell off the back of a truck in China and they wound up in Myanmar, that would
mm,
kind of have been par for the course. But these days, if
mm,
a consignment of weapons winds up across the border in the hands of an ethnic armed organization, that
mm,
is not because some, quartermaster sergeant was trying to make a couple of dollars on the side. He'd be
mm,
facing a firing squad for that. Like someone higher up had to approve that
mm,
sort of a shipment. And
mm,
so we see direct involvement, and again with interviews that we've done with Jason Tower, like talking about how
mm,
much the evidence shows that the Chinese have influence over these groups.
mm,
This brings us to the question of the potential disintegration of Myanmar. Do you think that there is a possibility that as the military is pushed back towards Naypyidaw or potentially fully collapses, you have a lot of these groups, let's say groups in the Northeast, that are being directly or indirectly supported by Chinese interests, who maybe want to start carving out their own version of the new Myanmar, and groups elsewhere in the country who look at that and go, well, we don't want to fall under that type of external control. We have a different vision for the country, and the country fractures. Is that something that we have to be very conscious of as we try to assist in the revolution, not to sort of tip the scales into a situation that could lead to that sort of fragmentation?
Yeah, I mean that definitely is a risk. We don't want to ignore that risk, but I just think that the resistance is so unified, that um, they'll be able to figure it out. Basically, it's a cliche, but where there's a will, there's a way, and I believe that the consensus, the overwhelming majority of people in Myanmar um, um, want to establish a genuine federal democracy. Now, what that means in practice, who knows? But I don't think the country will fracture. I mean, I think the key question, I think a lot of it will boil down to how much the big sticking points will be how much um, um, control over taxation and revenue from resources, local resources, do the local states have? And then, of course, like who gets their own state? Yeah, Palong, they probably want their own state, and then maybe maybe other groups will want their own state. Yes, that's a problem, but I think they'll be able to sort it out. Like I said, where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, people are concerned about Rakhine, right? Wanting to have a kind of a WA type of uh, how do you call that? State within a
Like
state
an
or something like
autonomous
that?
state.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
so people concerned about that, and then if that happens, maybe other groups will want it. But I don't know. My understanding is that the Rakhine are willing to sort of play along, and establish, because they know that they'll be stronger by as a country working together with the other groups and the other states.
I think that's a very sort of positive assessment. We very much hope that that is going to be the conclusion that everyone
Yeah. Well, the
comes
reason
to.
the reason I say that, I mean,
Mhm.
I say, I mean, one of the reasons I say that is not just like wishful thinking or not just like being positive and all that. Although, yes, generally speaking, I guess I'm a positive kind of person, but so we have to take that into consideration. But one of the reasons I say that is that I've been to fundraising events around the world, in a few different countries around the world, where you have members of the diaspora from many different ethnic groups coming together, and donating money, their hard-earned money, to the revolution. And I mean, a lot, like in the States, for example, I know that a lot of the refugees do not have high incomes, and yet they're still sacrificing a lot and giving a large portion of their income to the Spring Revolution. I mean, the diaspora is basically the one that's funding the entire revolution. And they're doing it together. There's a lot. I think most of the events that I know of, for in the diaspora to raise money are kind of like Myanmar-wide events. Like everyone is invited. Like even there, I went to a Chin event here in Japan recently, and yeah, I mean a lot of non-Chin people were there, and yeah, I mean the only these days I think the only events where it's like ethnic group specific are like religious events, and they don't raise money at those events anyways. So there's a lot more unity than people realize, and I have evidence to prove it. I mean, I've been to these events, I talk to these people in Burmese, and they tell me, we want to win the revolution, we want to set up a democracy. Nobody says like, oh, we want to win the revolution and set up, an independent Karen state or an independent Rakhine state. I haven't even heard that. They're really keen about sort of establishing a unified Myanmar.
I think I'm really glad that you mentioned that. It's good to hear, because there's a difference between, someone sitting on top looking down going, well, objectively the country would be better off, unified, and maintaining its territorial integrity, which, from perspectives of opportunities and economic growth, is just objectively true. But it's a very different perspective from the ground. So hearing, as you say, minorities within Myanmar who have historically been the victims of the central authority, expressing the desire to maintain the unity of the country, granted with a federal democratic system and greater devolution of powers, but to maintain that unity of the country, I think is a very important piece of information, and something that, again, needs to be given oxygen, so that people know that it's not that all of the ethnic minority groups are just waiting for that opportunity to grab a bit of land and run off and design a new flag for themselves. It really is a concerted effort to root out the military, which has been the root of all of the country's problems for the last 75 years.
Right. And I guess one thing I'd like to say is I get the sense that the different ethnic groups from Myanmar have a sense of community, and not just within the diaspora, but back in Myanmar as well. And I mean, a lot of the people that are in the diaspora just recently moved to the States or wherever. So we can't just say like, oh, they've been Americanized or something. I mean, I don't know. Like, maybe it's wishful thinking. Maybe I'm being too optimistic. But that's just my belief. I think that they'll find a way to pull it off. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a walk in the park. It's not going to be perfect. But I think they'll find a way to do it. And in fact, it might get ugly at times. There might, because there are weapons floating around. Yes, some people might die. We have to. We can't discount that risk. We have to take that risk seriously. But I don't think it's going to be a huge civil war and the country's going to disintegrate. I think that just plays into a kind of narrative, a very long-standing narrative, which is based on facts, of course. But I don't think this narrative applies anymore. And I think people that overplay this narrative are kind of falling into a kind of like a trope or some kind of stereotype or even racist type of thing. I don't know, but I just, in my opinion, I think they can pull it off.
I mean, I like that. I like not only that you're saying it, but that you're saying it with genuine conviction, which is very different than hearing someone just saying like, well, the information on the sheet of paper that I have in front of me indicates that everything will be fine. But you're coming from actually having spoken to these people. Again, I think it's just vital then that message be hammered home so that people are aware of it. But you have the reality about you to note that the ticking time bomb is that this has been a protracted conflict. We are coming up now on the 3rd anniversary of the revolution, and the weapons that have been obtained, the weapons that were previously in storage that have now been distributed, and even the weapons that have now newly been manufactured, as the revolutionary forces have developed manufacturing capability of weapons. This is a country which, to people who've never been in Myanmar, in the actual Burma heartland, it is surprisingly demilitarized. Weapon ownership was not normal. Living there during the faux democracy, let's say, from the 2010 period onwards, it's the images that some movies portray of, armed soldiers on every street corner and people just occasionally being, dragged off by secret police and stuff. That just wasn't the experience I've had or the experience of anyone that I know who lived there during that time. The proliferation of arms in a country that has not historically been that familiar with weaponry, it is deeply concerning. But so here is my bigger question. Do you think that there is a fear on the part of Western actors that, hey, the situation is going to be messy and there's no way to avoid the messiness? And if we get involved and if we touch this, we are inevitably going to be tainted. Journalists are going to be asking us questions. Why did you back a movement that now has been associated with, a rise in firearms violence, or a movement that has splintered into a couple of groups that are going around and doing bad things? And that fear of being associated with anything that is less than rosy and perfect is stopping people from wanting to act for the greater good.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially in the context of the U.S., which has this terrible history in Southeast Asia. There's just a distaste for doing anything, even remotely, similar to what all of the shenanigans that the U.S. did in Indochina during that period. So that might be part of it. But of course, the U.S. has no qualms about doing crazy stuff all in other parts of the world. But yeah, you do raise a good point, and so yeah, I mean, that might be part of it. Yeah, that might be part of it. That might be one of the reasons why countries like the U.S. are reluctant to get involved. But I mean, what I would like to convey is what I just said earlier about the unity of Myanmar people and their conviction and their passion about overthrowing the junta and setting up a unified country, and I hope that policymakers in the U.S. and other countries can get that message and not be so concerned that whatever they do to get involved is going to spark World War III or something like that. I don't think that's going to happen. That's ridiculous. Yeah. The era of these proxy wars, at least between China and the U.S. I mean, I don't want to say it's over, but the proxy wars nowadays are between like U.S. and Russia, U.S. and Iran, via Israel, but U.S. and China. I mean, I guess Taiwan is a proxy war, but I don't. I guess Japan and the China conflict is they don't have a conflict, but yet. But I guess that's a proxy. But I don't envision a proxy war between China and the U.S. over Myanmar. I don't think it's going to happen. Thailand would not let it happen, and the people of Myanmar would not let it happen, which is more important.
Because this has been one of those consistent points that has come up since very early on in the coup. And I remember all the way back in 2021 when the focus was on the international community and there was a very heavy focus on the United Nations and specifically the Security Council. A lot of people were very hopeful. And, those who remember 2021 protest movements, there was a very heavy emphasis for a period of time on R2P, the responsibility to protect, which is a United Nations principle in law. And China consistently blocked, along with Russia, China either abstained or consistently blocked movements that would have taken a more firm line on Myanmar. And so there was this thinking that the Chinese are not going to let anyone encroach on their doorstep. They're not going to let anyone else get involved in a country that they neighbor. Either they are going to get involved or they're going to let the situation play out as it plays out and then deal with the result, but they don't want anyone else getting that close. Right. And I think that's where a lot of the concept of this proxy war possibility has been coming from. But once again, as you've pointed out, and as others have pointed out that you've cited, Chinese attitudes towards the junta have shifted. And yeah, it's not as likely that the Chinese would act, or at least that seems to be what I'm hearing here.
Right,
Um,
right. Also, yeah, and also, I mean, the era of the U.S. doing crazy shit in Myanmar is over. I mean, the people who are the most alarmed about a proxy war that I've talked to among my friends come from an earlier era where the U.S. did all kinds of crazy crap in Southeast Asia, including supporting these KMT, gangsters running
mm,
around Shan State and stuff like that. And so I can understand where they're coming from. But in my opinion, I mean, I'm getting old now too. I'm not, but I wasn't around back then. But in my opinion, it's just not going to happen.
mm.
The
And
Myanmar
so
people would
this,
not allow that to happen.
which, and I think that's actually a separate factor, but one that I think in a lot of historical cases we have a lack of agency
Mhm.
being ascribed to the people themselves. Like when we talk about, for example, the Vietnam War, it's the emphasis is usually on first the French and then subsequently the Americans
Mm.
versus the Russian-backed communists. They're not even necessarily thought of as Vietnamese people; they're thought of as communists. This outside
Um,
influence, and it's a
um,
narrative that often
yeah.
avoids talking about the agency that the Vietnamese people themselves had
Right.
um,
Right.
in that conflict. And again, same things when we talk about Cambodia, when we talk about Laos, and Myanmar is a. I mean, I don't want to use positive adjectives for Myanmar in this case because we have seen almost 3 years of horrific human rights violations. Like this, there's nothing glorious about what's happening here. There's nothing
Mm,
uplifting about this. This is despicable, and it is an
mm,
affront to the very concept of humanity. But it
mm,
is also a case in which the people themselves, with scant little international support,
mm,
have managed to stand up and take on a very large
mm,
and disgustingly overfunded military from
mm,
scratch. Like people who have
mm.
never been in the same room as a firearm in their lives
Yeah.
have now, in very short order, moved to the front lines
Yeah.
and have taken the fight to the military themselves. Like this is
Yeah.
it's not unheard of, but it is the exception historically rather than the rule. And I
Right.
think you're very on the point to
Mhm.
bring up that the Myanmar people are not going to let international actors play a very self-centered international geostrategic game, and they have proven over the last 3 years that
Right.
if they don't want something, they
Mm.
can make that thing not happen.
Right, right. That, yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think after all the successes that they've had, going up against this powerful military, with little help from the outside, largely on their own. I mean, it's been an epic struggle, and I think that they're winning, and I think many books will be written about this struggle.
Mm,
And and women are involved even in the front
mm,
lines as well, and as nurses and doing all kinds of other things, taking leadership roles, and so yeah, it's I mean, it's a thing, it's a movement, it's a revolution, as Matthew Arnold was saying. So um
mm,
what were we talking about? Oh yeah, so yeah, I mean, I so I was saying that they're a lot more proud and have a lot more confidence after this spectacular successes that they've been having. And so for that reason alone, I think they have the strength, and the smarts, to not let their country get dragged into some kind of crazy proxy conflict. They're just not going to allow that to happen. And the best evidence to support this is this document that the NUG just released. It's China position paper, which said like, hey, China, don't worry about us. I mean, basically, the underlying message was that don't worry about us becoming a kind of Western puppet. We'll protect Chinese investments in Myanmar. We'll help you crack down on the scamming industry, and so they're just not gonna they're strong enough and smart enough not to allow their country to be dismantled by torn apart by some proxy war. And so another point I want to make relating to this is that nowadays countries around the world are very good and very smart, and they know how to play off the major powers against each other in order to preserve their independence, number one, and number two, to extract as many benefits from both sides as possible. And Myanmar is no exception. And that's exactly why the NUG released that document, and that's exactly why I think that there's not a huge risk of a proxy war. Okay, yes, there is a risk. We can't ignore that. We can't be naive, but I don't think it's a huge risk. And I think it's a risk worth taking in terms of at least doing humanitarian aid and maybe more.
Absolutely, and I think this sort of brings us to the question of the future and what we can expect, because your article, I mean, it's the length that these articles have to be, because as you say, a lot of really valuable stuff gets cut and hacked and slashed to fit it to format. But your article spends most of its time talking about what's going on right now, what could we be doing, and then at the end of it, you touch on this idea, saying that the U.S., in assisting, the U.S. would engender enormous goodwill among the Myanmar people and position itself as a key player in Myanmar's reconstruction and transition to democracy. And so this is now that focus not on helping the revolution to win, but on the more important part, and the part where historically Western powers have phenomenally fumbled the ball. The case that comes to mind for me, for example, would be Afghanistan, when the U.S. funded the Afghans to fight against the Russian invasion, but then just sort of left the country, littered with guns, littered with unexploded munitions, and all of the ravages of war, and just let it sort of fester. And well, okay, we see the results of that. It's that aftercare, that rebuilding, that reconstruction, and that transition to stability that's so important. Do you think, first of all, now that we've spoken about the agency of the people themselves, do you think the Myanmar people would welcome Western powers being involved in that?
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, they still sort of admire, I guess you could say, countries like the United States that have a democracy, and they want to learn from the United States. That's why I've been asked to teach about constitutional law and federalism. I think they sort of see the U.S. and other Western countries as a kind of model. Of course, they're not going to copy the model exactly, and they'll come up with their own, sort of system. But I mean, if you ask a normal person, would they prefer a kind of a democracy based on a real constitution, not a military drafted constitution? I think 99% of the people in Myanmar would say yes.
Well, that's ironic, because apparently 99% of people voted for the 2008 Constitution,
Oh yeah,
as the military tells us all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, damn it. In the middle of Cyclone Nargis, of course.
Yeah.
So would then Western powers, like, what role do you think Western powers could or should play to help the transition, but to not overstep the line and try to take over the show, but also to make sure that things are transitioning as smoothly as possible, and as you repeatedly say, with that emphasis on minimizing human loss during these periods of uncertainty?
Oh, what kind of West? Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. I wish I was a little bit more knowledgeable about humanitarian aid and demobilization and military type stuff. So I mean, I'm just trying to think the best I can comment about that is maybe just sort of being available if the new Myanmar government asks for something. You know what I'm saying? That might be an interesting approach rather than saying, "Oh, this is what we're going to do." Just sort of, be there and see what they need. You know?
Okay, so it's more not boots on the ground and let's get in there and let's do the thing. It's more just
Mhm.
keeping your phone on loud and making sure that you pick up when they ring and
Right.
setting aside resources for this. I think
Right.
it's an interesting approach. Do you think though that that's sellable? Because I haven't been working in this space much, but the
Mhm.
impression that I get very much when it comes to things like development projects is that
Mhm.
vague does not get a tick. If you say, "Oh, we want to do something in the hopes that positive things can emanate," or "We want to just, hang around in case something goes on,"
Mhm.
people usually say, "Okay, I'm not interested in something like that." What seems to get people excited is when you say, "I have a specific project. I plan to go to this place. I plan to do this thing. This is my time frame," and that seems to be easier to sell because it's a specific project that has specific limitations. You know how
Right.
much it's
Right.
supposed to cost. You can
Right.
evaluate whether it succeeded or failed. Do you think you can sell this idea to governments to say, like, "I'm not asking you to do something specific. I'm just asking you to be ready"?
Right, right. Yeah, that's a that's a really good point. And I think David Matheson wrote a recent article which says that um, amateurs do strategy and real leaders do logistics. And so maybe this shows that I'm not a real leader, but so I think you're right that there should be something concrete. But I'm thinking, well, maybe U.S. might sort of view this as an opportunity to not only help Myanmar, but kind of improve its ties with Thailand, because a lot of this
Mm.
stuff is going to go through Thailand. And yes, there's a kind of competition between China and the U.S. and Thailand as well. And so maybe for that reason, U.S. policymakers might get excited about having Myanmar rebuilding efforts sort of go through Thailand. And yeah, but I mean, like you said, you're probably right. There should be a kind of concrete plan, and unfortunately, it's beyond my pay grade.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we'll obviously have to see and obviously have to just, continue trying to get
Mm-hmm.
accurate and correct information out there
Mm-hmm.
in the hopes that decision makers get access to it. But
Yeah. But I
all of
mean, I
that
think,
being
I
said,
mean, I think,
yep.
I think, like basically, like, so one of the reasons I wrote that article and took the angle that I did is because, like, basically nowadays, the only way to get attention from policymakers in Washington D.C. is to take a China angle. For for better or worse, that's what you have to do. And I said that on Twitter recently in response to Scott Marcial, who's concerned about proxy war and emphasizing strategic issues and all that. And I said, hey, look, for better or worse, this is this is the only thing people in DC agree on and what motivates them nowadays. And so that's what you have to do if you want to get things done. And in fact, I think the China angle that I took is valid. And so yeah, in terms of rebuilding, maybe it's a similar type of thing. Advocates like myself can try to tell U.S. policymakers, it's like, hey, maybe if we work together with Thailand and maybe Japan to do these rebuilding efforts, and we can have like some kind of rebuilding center in Bangkok or something like that. I don't know, and maybe allocate a certain amount of resources to in terms of money to that center, and then that money could be distributed as the requests come in from the new Myanmar government. yeah, so that might motivate U.S. Policymakers. But yeah, like I said, above my pay grade.
Fair enough. I think ultimately that's kind of a problem that we always face. You know, even on
Mm,
in general on this podcast, like we
mm.
have a lot of people come on who are very well informed, very educated, very knowledgeable, but nobody knows everything about everything, and nobody can predict everyone else's moves. So
Mm,
there's always going to be that limit of like, well, nope, I don't know what that. But it's kind of like playing chess
mm.
where you can only see about 8 of the squares at any given time, and you don't know where the other pieces are and what they're doing. It you know, the fog of war is I think really a great hindrance to
Right.
building up the accurate picture and making the right decisions at the right time. But
Yeah. Yeah.
nevertheless, all that being said, I think it's a pretty robust overview of the situation and the prognosis. And again,
Mm,
I would encourage any of our readers to go and read the original article, Why the US Needs to Back Myanmar's Spring Revolution. We'll probably link it
mm,
down below on the
mm.
Diplomat. It is a good read, but I think you do listen to our podcast, so you'd probably be familiar with it. But at the end of the episode, we invite the guests to just share some thoughts that they'd like the audience to bear in mind as they go on about their day, or maybe as they talk to some of their colleagues. So if you have anything that you think would be particularly useful for the people to think about, please do share it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe for the listeners in the diaspora, or if they're listening in Myanmar, I mean, I just want to say, like, um, you know, the revolution is going to win soon. Okay, so but basically, we 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 still have to be patient. That's going to be key. Nothing good ever comes easy. Rome wasn't built in a day. I've learned that patience is so important in life, and so yeah, there's a lot of momentum right now, especially after 1027. And yes, we want to capitalize on this momentum, but as Anthony Davis pointed out in his article, we can't sort of overdo it. We don't want to rush too much. We still got to be smart. I mean, the revolution has been smart all along, very methodical in planning all this out. So I think we just have to continue with the methodical planning, and just yeah, just be patient, I guess. I mean, it doesn't mean like don't work hard. Yes, we got to work hard, but we can't expect things to happen, as fast as we want them to happen. We just have to try our best. Yeah, 조사봐.
Many of you know that in addition to running the Insight Myanmar podcast platform, we also formed a nonprofit, Better Burma, to respond to the terror that the Burmese military has been inflicting on the country and its people. We encourage listeners to check out our blog to see what work Better Burma has been carrying out, along with the upcoming projects we hope to support. Right now, as I'm sure you all know, and today's interview only reinforced, that the ongoing need is overwhelming. A donation of any amount goes towards those vulnerable communities who need it most, and it will be so greatly appreciated. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam poda ba yaranam no